Hey everybody, it's Karl from InRange. We're here in Laplace, Louisiana at the André Plantation House, which is today known as the 1811 Kid Ory Museum. This is where the 1811 Slave Revolt began, a little-known chapter in early American history that happens to be of great fascination to both of us. The 1811 Slave Revolt was the largest uprising of enslaved people in American history. In just a few short, intense days in January 1811, a mixed-race slave driver named Charles Deslandes led an army of rebels, possibly as large as 500 strong, against the city of New Orleans itself. Deslandes outmaneuvered American troops sent against him by Territorial Governor William C.C. Claiborne, only to be later crushed by a militia of French Creole planters led by none other than his old master, Manuel André. This video will focus specifically on the military history of the revolt. If you don't know much about this event, I'd recommend watching the video I made about it 2 years ago, which is more of a blow-by-blow narrative account. Karl and I have both visited plenty of plantation museums in the area, so we had a certain expectation of what it would be like. But I think we were both very surprised by what we found.
Once you get to a place and you actually walk around, suddenly what you read in a book, and you get there and walk through the building, you're like, this doesn't really add up the way it reads in the book. But so we're getting 2 videos. You're getting yours, which is going to be a little more rigid, I'm going to say that, in a good way. I mean that as an academic and an approach to history, that's important.
Yeah, rigid, erect, firm.
But I also believe that, I do think that there is a value in the go see it and go, gosh gee, this just doesn't quite add up kind of thing. And so that's the 2 videos.
The museum at this site is brand spanking new, and only opened in February of 2021. The 1811 exhibit is unapologetically presented from the enslaved point of view, which is still the exception, rather than the norm, out here in plantation country, though things are changing. The managing director of the museum is historian and former journalist John McCusker. Karl and I liked him a lot. He's a character, definitely a man after our own hearts.
I'm sort of the keeper of the bones here with my partner Charlotte, who is an academic historian. She's in the PhD program at LSU. But being able to share the story in this context, in this place, it's almost like I'm the abbot, you know, and I've got my little cell in the corner where I live, just like the abbot. And, sorry, once a Catholic, always a Catholic.
John was initially drawn to the house because of his fascination with jazz pioneer Kid Ory, who was raised here in the late 19th century.
I had written a book on Kid Ory, a biography on him, and it came out in 2012, and I'd moved on and done other things. I retired from newspapering in 2016, and one of the last stories I did was that this house, which I had never stepped foot on the property the whole time I was working on the Ory book, was up for sale. So I got to come here and walk through the house. It was in really dreadful shape, and Tim Sheehan, the man that bought it, moved in with his dad with a sleeping bag and a bag of tools, and they just went to work and they restored it. And a year and a half later, I get a call from the new owner saying, you know, you're interested in putting a museum in here. And at that point, I'm only thinking Kid Ory, but what his architect had discovered was, contrary to popular belief, the André house was never demolished. This entire house as it exists as an ad hoc structure that had 2 or 3 major renovations through its history. But the original floorboards that the Andrés walked upon and Charles Deslandes walked upon that night are still here.
This is an architectural diagram of the building we're standing in, and this building was built in 1793, so it's quite old and it's seen a lot of changes over time. But this yellow part appears to be the original André Plantation home, and that means it is likely that one of those 2 rooms are the rooms in which the actual first killing happened and the first attack happened that started and launched the 1811 Slave Revolt. And one of the things about that makes that seem to be pretty clear is when we look at the floor and the woodwork. So this is like original wood flooring, but over here where things have changed, you can see it's much more modern and new and been renovated. But when you come over here, you start seeing different woodwork. And when we go into over here towards the fireplace, for example, this is pretty much hand hewn and done in the old way.
I think when people hear the word plantation, they hear the South, they imagine this grand manse, you know, in a row of oaks and so forth. And really, most Southern plantations were much more workaday affairs. And often they were investment properties for really rich folks that never even came here. They would just install somebody as the manager, and this was just like a blue chip investment and so forth. That I discovered, which was very interesting. But this was a very modest house. It was 2 or 3 rooms with maybe a porch. It wasn't some grand place.
So, on January 8th, 1811, in either this room or the adjoining room, Manuel Andry was asleep. It was around midnight. Huge storm outside. Charles Deslandes and about 20 of his slaves, or of Andry's slaves rather, come in and stand around the bed, armed with hatchets and cane knives. Andry wakes up, sees a bunch of really angry enslaved dudes, and they start hacking him up. He is able to fight his way out of it, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, so not terribly surprising. He was a tough dude. And as he's escaping, his son, Gilbert, runs in with a sword. Slaves turn on him, hack him to pieces, and Andry is able to escape. He gets to, bleeding, full of holes, he gets to the river, finds a rickety old canoe, and rows to freedom to the West Bank, where he rallies the support of the plantation owners there. That's the beginning of the revolt. What can you tell us about the weaponry that these rebels would have used, Karl?
So at that point, we're all familiar with what an axe is. I mean, an axe is an axe. A cane knife, not everyone's going to be familiar with a cane knife. A cane knife is specifically designed for the purposes of harvesting sugarcane. Not that long, about yay long, but a lot of heft at the front because you swing and use the mass of the front of that cane knife to cut through the sugarcane. Harvesting sugarcane was actually a very dangerous job. In fact, people frequently hacked themselves or others with it because it would move through the cane and injure other enslaved people. Very dangerous work, but that's what they used in the first Malay attack, according to that narrative. Once they did that, the other thing that that Charles supposedly knew about was that this happened to be also the sort of headquarters for the local militia. And they went to the militia, the armory. They break open the door and they get in there and they don some of the militia gear to take on an air of an official military. Influence from Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, which he donned, proper gear to look like a military, because they didn't want, this wasn't as so much as a guerrilla as a, we are doing this, we are powerful, right?
Yes.
Also,
This is an army.
An army. They armed themselves with a small number of, according to the official narrative, of smoothbore flintlock muskets. But people, especially modern people around modern guns, think to themselves, well, a gun is a huge force multiplier. And I'm going to argue with you that you could argue that maybe it wasn't so much of a great force multiplier against those cane knives and axes, because when you talk about a smoothbore flintlock, the reality is the reloading time and all the things that go with it. Once you get that first shot, you've got pretty much nothing more than a club.
And of course, there's a reason that there was line infantry was a thing.
Exactly, and on top of that, these guns were really only effective for aimed fire out to 50 yards, 100 yards if you're lucky, because it's a smoothbore and that ball just doesn't go all that straight. So, never mind the rain. The reality is a small number of these to now what was enslaved people's army that have not been militarily trained with firearms. These aren't necessarily not warriors. They know tactics. They know these things, but these weapons, to be effective in the way we think of firearms effective, you have to be a real military force. You have to line abreast. These guys are loading while these guys are firing to keep a constant rate of fire.
It takes training.
It takes official training to make that firearm something useful.
Very dangerous information to teach.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over back to Arizona real quick on the video. I can do it in just a second. I'll show you how.
Are you sure? I mean, that'll probably take a while.
I'll be back here real quick. And so what I'm going to demonstrate to you guys is that I have one of these smoothbore flintlocks. I'm going to show you this versus a cane knife, and the accuracy you're going to get out of it maybe wasn't all that great. So I'm going to head over there right now.
Okay. Are you flying? Or are you?
No. Just get with me with this. Ready?
Oh, okay.
3, 2, 1. Boom! Here we are in the Arizona desert. Isn't that amazing? So what we have here is a Pedersoli reproduction of a 1795 Springfield 69 caliber smoothbore musket. Now, the chances of them having what would have been considered a top-line weapon in the militia armory is unlikely. However, what they probably had was a 1700s, 1765, 17-something Charleville 69 caliber smoothbore musket, also flintlock. Many of those French Charleville muskets were in the armories of the United States and were used in the Revolutionary War, amongst other things. So for them being in the militia would have been the most likely scenario. Regardless, the 1795 Springfield is nothing more than an American reproduction, or I should say American manufactured Charleville musket. They essentially copied the gun identically, down to even simple things like this barrel band up here. They're almost hard to determine one from the other unless you actually get to look at them closely. So we have here something that is equal in performance to what if the enslaved people had broken that armory, and if they found weapons, and if they found ammunition, this is what they would have had. We have a target down there at 50 yards. And what I want to demonstrate for you is the loading process, and that the individual that doesn't have training with an individual musket, meaning they know the idiosyncrasies and quirks of that particular musket, and the fact that they don't know how to work together as a militia, in that they are not well regulated in terms of doing volley fire and one person loading while the other one's firing, etc. Even a large number of these amongst people that have not had a lot of discipline and training with it does not really provide much of a force multiplier. So personally, I don't think they found any weapons. I think the weapons were at home with the planter class, and when they broke in the armory they found uniforms and drums, and they probably were only armed with cane knives and axes. But that's neither here nor there for this. So let's go through the process of loading this and showing you that even at 50 yards, someone like myself, who frankly shoots a lot, may not actually hit that target. So this is actually a Civil War era pouch. I don't have a leather ammunition pouch from that period, but in terms of function, they're identical. So I'm going to open the pouch, and you cock your hammer, the half cock, and your frizzen is open. And you take out one of your paper cartridges, just like this. This is assuming that they even had paper cartridges in that armory. And you tear the end off. At that point, you kind of open up the pouch and you pour a little bit of the powder into this pan, which is your primer. Once you got enough of that in there, get the excess off. You close the frizzen like that. Then you still have powder and ball here. You take the rest of that, pour it down the muzzle, carefully seat the ball, and then ram it home. Reseat your ramrod, and you are now ready to fire one shot. Let's see if we can hit it at 50 yards. If it even goes off. And lo and behold, it went off, which, by the way, with a gun that you haven't used yet, might not. And I missed. Let's go ahead and reload again. I missed again. I'm telling you, unless you have a lot of practice with these guns, and I do not have a lot of practice with this gun, 50 yards is a challenging shot. Let's see if we can get it on the third one. Hey, there it is. Third shot. Nice good hit on the steel. See if we can do that one more time. Yeah, we got another hit. So as you see, I'm starting to really figure this thing out. Let's see if I can go a little faster here, but speed is not of the essence with these things. That's why you need a squad. Yeah. So now I've got it figured out. 50 yards, I can reliably make hits. But imagine, under stress, may or may not have a lot of ammunition, a gun you're not familiar with, being fired at by a trained militia, while trying to fight for your lives and freedom as an enslaved rebel army. I could see why they may not have had much of an effect, even though in modern days we think, well, they got guns. Maybe that didn't matter.
Eventually, the rebel army was defeated by militiamen who were led by Manuel Andry himself, returned for revenge for the death of his son. Now, we're told that the rebels had a small number of firearms. Obviously, the militia, even though they were vastly outnumbered, they would have been armed to the frickin' teeth.
Yep. Well, as well as they could be at the time.
As well as they could be, for sure. But the trouble, here's kind of the trouble with this, though. The rebels outnumbered the militia. We're told that they did have some guns, and yet there were no casualties on the planter side of this final battle.
Now, to argue that from a tactical perspective, we could make the argument. We could make the argument that they were relatively unskilled with these types of weapons, that they did not necessarily know the effective range of them. It could have fired them at distances that it was unlikely to make relatively good hits. They also may not have been aware or trained in a way to do some sort of volley fire where they were firing to keep sustained fire. So if they were just firing at will, it would be very easy to close ranks with a properly trained martial element like a militia, and then do volley fire, get within range, probably 50 yards with a smooth bore, and actually then
get within range, Karl?
But get within, exactly, to get within the range of the effective capabilities of your firearm. And if you were well disciplined and trained, well regulated, you actually would have a much better chance. So I think you could argue that they just really weren't capable with those weapons.
Yeah,
or
that they missed in just circumstances, you know?
It's possible.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible, but kind of unlikely.
It seems weird.
So, yeah, I mean, and this is often sort of framed as a battle.
Yes.
But, I mean, it might have just been a bit more of a massacre.
A massacre or a rout.
Yeah.
And I think you could say massacre when you look at the actual KELD, KIA in action here, right?
Yeah.
Very significant number of enslaved people dying for their freedom on the battleground.
Yeah. But here's the question, and here's something we kind of talked about briefly off camera, but like, what would have happened if the revolt had succeeded?
Wow. Okay. Yeah, we did talk about this off camera. So let's say that they'd gotten a lot of firearms. They had been able to defend themselves against the militia, and the New Orleans was sacked, and they took control of this entire portion of what was then the United States. They would have, in my opinion, now we're getting into tactics and other things, a huge military force would have come upon them. And unless there was recognition from some third party, like France or something like that, to empower them, they would have just been crushed later.
Yeah, I agree.
And it would have taken time, and it would have been it would have been a much more bloody conflict, and there would have been more casualties on the other side.
Absolutely.
And I doubt, though, that they would have been able to hold it without some sort of external support.
Yeah, you're completely right. But even if, let's say just hypothetically for a moment that does happen, right? And that there is New Orleans is sacked, and the rebellion succeeds, and we have, the Black Republic of the Mississippi or whatever. If that happens, that would be. We've talked about how this event was repressed intentionally, how its memory has only emerged recently, after 200 years. That would be impossible to ignore.
Yeah, that would not have been able to be ignored.
That would alter the course of American history in an immense way. I mean, it's sort of comparable to something almost like the Civil War, where it is seen as this sort of massive...
Oh, it probably would have triggered it sooner.
Yeah, probably would have.
Yeah. Because I think that at that point, that freedom is the desire to be free, and when I think people who are not free realize that there's a chance at it, most human nature is inclined to let's get that, because who wants to be enslaved? That's an incredible crime against just the general mindset of the human being. And so I think that kind of freedom would have been catchy, and there would have been a growing revolt.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Countrywide.
Yeah. But of course, also growing reprisals, because of course, knowing the planter class as we do, slave revolt being their greatest fear.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden it happens and it succeeds, not across the Gulf of Mexico and Haiti, though of course that was still really too close for comfort for planters, both here in North America, also in South America, but something right on their back door just would have been impossible to ignore, and I'm sure they would have cracked down in an intensely draconian fashion on slaves in Virginia.
This gets super deep into the idea of using force for civil rights, because I mean, there's a number of books on the topic, and you can go up into the 50s, 60s, even till the modern day. I mean, just now, retribution is usually pretty fierce.
And that's sort of also an important thing that needs to be told about the story is that it was a quarter, approximately, of the slaves on the German coast region decided to join the revolt. That's 3/4.
That means 3/4 decided this didn't seem like a good idea.
Yeah. And that, is also completely understandable.
Oh, it's right. Oh, yeah. No, I don't want to understate that decision. I don't want to undermine that decision either.
Yeah, no.
These are incredibly difficult.
But I just think that's like another part of the story.
You're absolutely right. These are incredibly difficult decisions that can only be made, and that's what I was trying to say, on the individual basis.
Yeah.
Now, we could argue that if all of them had done this, would it have succeeded? You still don't know.
Yeah.
Because frankly, reality is the Navy would have sailed on up and shelled New Orleans. And in fact, one thing we didn't talk about in the video is that the United States government, the federal government, was essentially complicit. The local planter class is what ultimately used their militia to crush this. But after the deaths that occurred, the government, in a form of stipend, paid almost like an insurance type thing to all of the dead that were
$300 a head.
These were all property, and they were killed in crushing this insurrection. And therefore, while the general value of the time was $1,000 per head, the U.S. federal government chipped in $300 per enslaved person killed in crushing this uprising. So if you want to think that this was wholly enacted only by the planter class, that's not completely true, because the U.S. federal government, they helped.
Yeah, no, it was concerted and consulted between pretty much all the sort of levels of government and of power, both kind of local, sort of private power, like we have, you know, here with Manuel Landry and others, but also the federal power, and Claiborne, of course, being an agent of the federal government, being its representative in Louisiana, you know, its primary representative, and you know, John, the director of the museum, made a great point. We were just talking earlier, which was that New Orleans was the frontier. New Orleans was a frontier town. There was not much between here and, you know, Savannah. You know, it was. I mean, Andrew Jackson, you know, before the Battle of New Orleans, would be fighting Native Americans before he fought the British. You know, in Mississippi and Alabama and places. You know, so this was an outlying area. You know, and the Washington badly wanted Louisiana. Like, it was, I mean, we were made a year after the revolt, we were granted statehood, you know? And that's, I mean, you know, you saw it in other kind of frontier societies like California that were especially profitable and especially desirable, were kind of granted statehood before a lot of other places that geographically kind of make more sense if we're just sort of going west, you know? Oftentimes it was kind of the most federal sort of influence and the most federal money that was kind of poured into these places. Where the safe bets were places that America, we knew that Louisiana was going to pay off. Very strategically important here at the mouth of the Mississippi, and also, you know, being plantation country, and with sort of all the sugar that was being grown here, very profitable, very good for U.S. interests, right? So, no, absolutely. I mean, the U.S. government had just as much of a stake in the plantation slavery here in the German coast as the French colonials did, without a doubt. These two power structures, the French Creoles and the Anglo-Americans, were at loggerheads a lot of the time, but faced with this common threat, they sure buddied real quick.
Power aggregates.
Yeah, I mean, this was very eye-opening, and it was so awesome hanging out with my new buddy, Karl. And yeah, man, I hope we can do it. I hope I can get down.
I think that's a given.
Yeah, I hope we can do this again very soon.
And just remind the audience that these videos are going to be on both channels. So if you want one part of this discussion, over onto mine, and but a bigger part of the discussion, frankly, over here on your channel. So this is a great combined effort, and I think we're bringing really interesting, I'm not going to say different, but like other sides of the perspective to do two different parts of the conversation. So make sure you check them out.
All right, Karl. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you
for coming out. How about we drive back to the city and get some food?
That sounds like a good idea.
All right, let's get the hell out of here.